Hello, good morning. I'm Michael Conway of Renaissance, and I'm delighted to introduce you to today's webinar, which is Taking Control of Cloud Data Risk. And I'm delighted to have Nick Hogg from Fortra here to present this to us. What we want to do is make sure that this is a webinar that you guys get the benefit out of. It's not all about us talking or Nick talking in this case. It's about ensuring that you get the maximum benefit out of the webinar. You get what you need out of it. So for that reason, we want to make it as interactive as possible. Obviously, it is a webinar, so Nick will do a presentation. But if you have any questions, queries, concerns, comments, or otherwise, please put them into chat or put them into the Q&A or send them directly to myself, and we will take those questions at the end of the event. So it's really, really important that we give you what you want out of it. So if questions, queries, concerns, anything like that, happy to take all of those. A little bit about the housekeeping of the day, and then I'll pass over to Nick. All attendees are being muted for the session. The session is being recorded. There are a number of people who are unfortunately unable to attend who would like to have been able to attend. But the link will be made available to yourselves. So if you wish to share it with any colleagues or anybody like that, please do so afterwards. It also means that effectively you will get all the data, you'll get all the slides, etc. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Nick, and please come back on the Q&A. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. So just a bit of background about myself before we start. I'm on the training and enablement side of things with Fortra. So I spend a lot of my time both with our customers, understanding how our solutions can best help to address their data security and their compliance needs, and also spend a bunch of time with our partners, helping them to identify the best fits for their customers when it comes to cybersecurity, data protection, and compliance requirements. The Fortra Data Security Posture Management solution helps you to discover where your sensitive data lives, classify its importance, assess your data risk, and then apply the appropriate protection policies across your cloud storage services and SaaS apps, while providing you with the visibility and the control that you need in order to reduce risk. So in this session, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the cloud data protection challenges that organizations like yourselves face, and then we'll touch on how the Fortra DSPM solution can allow you to rapidly discover, classify, and protect your sensitive data in your cloud repositories and SaaS apps. First, though, I want to kind of position our data security posture management solution within the wider Fortra portfolio. So if we use this cyber attack chain to do that, our solutions really help you to identify and mitigate risks before they can be exploited by attackers, prevent attackers, malicious insiders, and user error from exposing your organization to increased risk, detecting when there's an event underway, and responding to that event in order to minimize the impact in your organization. One of the key drivers for us is really to ensure that our solutions allow you to reduce the operational cost and your cybersecurity burden of putting these defenses in place and meeting your compliance requirements. So today we're going to focus on our data security posture management solution, but I think it's worth highlighting that this sits within Fortra's wider data security portfolio. Within this portfolio, we have the classification solutions, the on-prem, the cloud DLP controls that allow you to not only identify and protect your sensitive data, but do that in a way where you can enable business process changes. So AI is the kind of constant drumbeat that we get asked about in conversations these days. And our solutions really help you to put in place the appropriate guardrails that will allow your organization to adopt AI, to leverage that to grow the business, do things faster and so on, but do that in a way where there are the appropriate guardrails in place to ensure that your users don't do something that might ultimately lead to a data loss event that would expose sensitive business information into these cloud AI apps, or a compliance violation because that person in the finance team thought it would be a good idea to put the extract from the customer database of 100,000 customer records into a cloud AI platform to do some analysis. they maybe didn't understand the implications when it comes to data security and compliance controls. So with our data security solutions, these really allow you to put those appropriate guardrails in place to facilitate that AI adoption, those digital transformation journeys, and ensure that the necessary controls are in place, not only to stop the malicious external attackers or the malicious insiders, but when it comes to data protection and compliance, so many of those events are not malicious, it's just a user who's doing something well intentioned. So you can put those appropriate guardrails in place to facilitate the legitimate business processes, but keep the operational overhead and the false positives down. With our solutions, these really help you to identify what sensitive data you have within your on-premise and your cloud environments, classify that data using a granular classification schema that provides context to that information, and then wrap the appropriate data protection controls around that data to make sure that you're protecting what's important, but also that you are able to facilitate the legitimate business processes so you can keep that end user friction down and that operational overhead down for your security and your compliance teams. Within this suite, we have a number of modular solutions, and you can take each one of these solutions and use that to address the immediate needs in front of you. But do that knowing that actually in the future, you do have options to expand that with additional layers of protection within this Fortra data protection and overall cybersecurity portfolio. So with our data classification solution, this allows you to scan your on-premise environment to find sensitive data and automatically classify that. And you can involve the end users in the classification process by giving them the plugins into common Office applications like Word or Adobe Acrobat, or into mail clients like Outlook, that can ensure that you can both automatically identify and classify the data, but you can involve the users there to leverage their level of understanding of that data and the legitimate needs that need to be applied to that. So that data classification solution, I think, is a great first step, because that allows you to identify what's important to the business. And that to me is very valuable, because often when I'm talking to organizations where their DLP and their compliance policies are struggling, it's because they haven't been able to sufficiently differentiate between the sensitive data and the less sensitive information. And if you can't do that, that's where those false positives creep up. That's where the operational overhead for the security and compliance teams creep up, and the end user friction, because people can't do their jobs. So use the classification to identify that data and classify that so that you've got the context added to that file wherever it goes, so that when it hits a DLP solution, whether it's our own one or a third party one, that will enhance the DLP protection policies while keeping the false positives down. The next part we have is the Fortra DLP solution itself. Now, this can sit at your endpoint and your network layers and give you full visibility into what's happening within the business. And then that allows you to put in place the informed protection policies that might stop that user from uploading that customer data into, I don't know, maybe Google, maybe Gemini or some other online AI app. But it will also facilitate the legitimate business processes that are going on within there. But more and more of our data is going into cloud environments, and that's where the DSPM solution really comes into its own. And we'll dig into this in a second, but really it allows you to identify what's within those cloud repositories, where it's stored, who's got access to it, classify the data, assess the data risk, and then wrap the appropriate protection controls around that information. And the great thing is that our DSPM solution actually sits within our wider secure service edge platform. So if you want to take those same, data protection and compliance policies that you're applying to the online cloud storage like a Dropbox, or the the S3 buckets, or a SaaS app like a Salesforce or so on, then with a few clicks, you can actually apply that to your data in motion and your email traffic and your web traffic with our email gateways and web gateways in the cloud. Or you can apply that to the Zero Trust Network Access controls within there where you might want to secure data that's held within legacy online CRMs or private cloud apps within there. So, as I said, each of those elements sits quite nicely on its own, and it has been designed to be entirely modular and deliver the benefits to you that you need it to deliver. However, because we have all of these elements within the wider Fortra data security portfolio, if you choose to deploy multiple solutions from us, then you can take advantage of the interconnections between these solutions. So if you've got data classification in place within your environment, then you can easily pull in the classification schema that's been applied to your on-premise data and enforce policies within the DLP side of things at the endpoint and the network layer. And if you've got the DSPM solution within there, then again, you can apply a consistent data discovery and classification policy to the cloud-based information and enforce that the protection controls at the endpoint, the network, and the cloud layers in a consistent manner. So let's dig into the data security posture management side of things in more detail now. As we kind of touched on, this allows you to understand where you have sensitive data within your cloud repositories, your SaaS apps, the GitHubs, the GitLabs of the world. You can classify the data as part of that process, and we can assess the data risk for you to help you understand where you've got sensitive information sitting in a cloud repository that it has no business within. Or maybe that data should be in the corporate OneDrive, but actually it's been shared with people outside of the organization, or it's sitting within a SharePoint, but it's sensitive M&A activity that has been shared with everyone inside of the organization. So we can help you to understand what the data risks are associated with that sensitive information. And then you can use the integrated DLP controls to ensure that the appropriate protection policies are wrapped around that information. Now, typically, when I'm talking to organizations about the data protection challenges specific to the cloud environments, a lot of the conversations will start off around the compliance side of things. So, PCI compliance, GDPR, DORA, NIS2, all of these that have the data protection requirements sitting within there. You need to be able to demonstrate that you have the appropriate controls in place that will not only stop that sensitive data from going into inappropriate cloud repositories, but also when that data has gone into an authorized cloud repository, that you've got the effective controls in place that can minimize the data risk and the compliance risk around that information. And we can absolutely help you tick those compliance checkboxes. But really, as a solution, this goes way further than just being that DLP or that compliance checkbox because of the depth of visibility and control that we have within this solution. Often when I'm talking to CISOs, and I spend a lot of time chairing kind of things like CISO roundtables and discussion panels, one of the key concerns that's gone back years now when it comes to data protection and compliance is around what they don't know. It's always the concern about that lack of visibility. We've got the training in place to educate our users about how we should be handling sensitive information. We've got the controls in place that give us some visibility into where that data is stored and how it's being shared, but it's the things that you don't know that could ultimately lead to that data loss event or that compliance event. So we can help you understand where you have that sensitive information sitting in those cloud repositories. We can help you identify who's got access to that information and how it's been shared both inside and outside of the organization. And then you can use that to put those informed policies in place to protect that information. Because what we see more and more as organizations go through those digital transformation journeys is you will be putting sensitive data into cloud repositories. We use a SharePoint in the cloud. We use a OneDrive. We've got S3 buckets. We've got, the GitHubs and GitLabs, or we've got CRMs like a ServiceNow or a Salesforce. These are legitimate repositories for sensitive information based upon our legitimate business processes. But once the data's gone into those cloud environments, we need to understand where it's been stored and how it's been accessed and how it's been shared and who with. And again, what we typically see with users is they don't always think about the compliance requirements. They don't always think about the data security requirements. So maybe that developer who's got a testing environment in AWS, who's got that extract from the customer database of 200,000 records to test against, has put that into an Amazon S3 bucket. But maybe they don't understand how to secure that S3 bucket in the best way possible. So now you've got sensitive data that's exposed to the outside world. So with a solution like ours, that gives you that visibility of where there's been that oversharing of data or those misconfigurations of security controls that have exposed that data to external or internal risks. And then again, you can use the integrated DLP controls to mitigate those risks. Now, whenever we talk about DLP and compliance, false positives are that kind of underlying drumbeat of the conversation, I guess, where organizations haven't been able to differentiate between what's sensitive to the business and what's not sensitive to the business. And that's what causes the false positives, pushes up the end user friction and the pushback from the organization, and increases the workload on the security and the compliance teams. So again, with the data classification element of this, that allows you to differentiate between what's sensitive and what isn't sensitive, which is already a great foundation when it comes to reducing those false positives. And then you can use those integrated DLP controls to, in a very granular way, facilitate the legitimate business processes while protecting what's important and stopping those inappropriate actions by your end users. So with the DSPM solution to mirror that kind of overall um, functionality that we provide with our data security platform, it gives you that ability to discover where you've got sensitive data in those cloud repositories, classify that data using a granular classification scheme, understand what the associated data risk is, where there are those misconfigurations and those overexposures of sensitive data, and then use the integrated DLP controls to automatically mitigate that risk. So let's drill down and look at these in a little bit more detail now. Starting with the discovery side of things, we can integrate with your cloud environments using our API connectors. Today, we can integrate with your kind of more traditional cloud collaboration tools, the OneDrives, the SharePoints, the um, Dropboxes and so on of this world. But we can also integrate with things like the S3 buckets or the blob storage where you might have sensitive information. We can integrate with CRMs such as the Salesforces and the ServiceNows, and we can integrate with maybe a code repositories such as a GitHub or a GitLab because maybe you're concerned about a developer who's about to download a huge chunk of the source code and then copy that off to an external drive and hand the resignation in before going to work for a competitor. So we can discover where you have sensitive data, both at rest and in use within these cloud repositories, to give you that visibility of where there's data stored in totally inappropriate locations, so it can be removed from those locations. But we can also give you visibility of where data is in an appropriate location, but maybe where it has been overexposed. So today, a lot of the focus of our DSPM solution is around our cloud repositories. However, we're adding functionality to this as we run through this year. So by the end of this quarter, you're going to see integrations with on-prem file stores. So we can do that on-prem discovery and classification. You'll see API integrations with the ChatGPT for Enterprise and MS Copilot. And we're integrating with data lakehouses such as Databricks in Q2, and then we'll be adding Snowflake in the second half of the year, and we'll be continuing to grow from that point of view. So that will, as we run through the year, not extend that data discovery from the cloud environments into the on-premise environment, the data lake warehouses, and so on. When we find the data, we can classify that data. Now, if you don't have a classification solution in place, that is perfectly fine. We're not reliant on a third-party classification tool to do this. We have our own integrated classification engine that uses a combination of AI-driven classifiers and rules-based classifiers so that when we've discovered that data, we can classify that appropriately. But if you do already use a classification solution like Fortra's own data classification suite, which grew out of our Titus and Bolden James acquisitions, then we can apply the same classification schema to the data that we discover in your cloud environments as you're already applying in your on-premise environments today. If you use a Microsoft Purview or a Google label, then again, we can ingest those classification schemas and make sure that we're applying those consistently when we perform that data discovery and the classification side of things. Now, with Google labels, it's worth pointing out that we can build a little bit on top of that, because if you are within the Google environment, you'll know that those labels are not persistent when the file moves outside of that Google environment. What we can do is, based upon those Google classification labels, we can actually apply persistent metadata to the file. So even if a file has been downloaded out of your corporate G Suite environment, we can make sure that there's a classification label that will travel with it, regardless of where it goes. Now, as part of that, along with classifying the data, we can assess the data risk that's associated with it. So we can help you understand where you have sensitive data in inappropriate cloud repositories. We can help you identify the oversharing of that sensitive information, either inside or outside of the organization. And crucially, we can identify security misconfigurations that are exposing that data to the outside world more than it should be from there. When we perform the classification, we will write the metadata into the document properties of the file. So that means that that is persistent metadata that will travel with that file regardless of where it is. So you can use our data discovery and classification to enhance your existing DLP controls. So if we perform that data discovery in the cloud environment and we apply the classification labels into the metadata, and one of your users legitimately downloads that document into the corporate environment because your policy says that they're allowed to do that. If you've got a third-party DLP solution in place, like a Trellix or something like that, then that can take advantage of the classification metadata that we've written in there to enhance the DLP policy, so that if the user subsequently tries to upload that to a personal Dropbox account or send that out through Gmail or just share that with a business partner who shouldn't be able to receive it, your on-premise DLP solution, regardless of whether it's a Fortra or a third-party one, will be able to use that metadata that's traveled with the file to ensure that the correct policy is enforced at that point in time. Now, one of the things to point out with the Fortra solutions where we see real value is you can have multiple labels associated with the data. So if you've maybe tried to use the sensitivity labels within Microsoft Purview, but you're finding that the four sensitivity labels within there are proving to be too restrictive, because how do you differentiate between confidential data that is related to a customer that contains PII versus some information that contains PCI versus confidential M&A activities versus confidential R&D activities? If everything is just confidential, it's very hard for a DLP solution to effectively differentiate between the legitimate use cases and the inappropriate use cases there. With our solution, because you can have these multiple classification labels associated with the data, then that provides more context both to our integrated DLP controls within the data security posture management platform, but also to third-party solutions as well. So it's not just confidential information, but it's confidential information that contains GDPR. It would fall under GDPR. It should be only shared internally, and this is the retention period for that data, and so on and so on. And that's the place where I think you can see some very quick wins if you've been struggling with false positives by providing more context to your DLP and compliance controls with these multiple classification labels. We don't just find that data and classify and identify the data risk and tell you about it. We have the integrated data loss prevention controls within here that actually allow us to automatically enforce policies around that. So if we have seen that extract of the customer database that's sitting in that S3 bucket that's overexposed, we can automatically fix that overexposure to ensure that that data is protected. If we see that that confidential M&A activity that's been uploaded into SharePoint but been shared with everyone inside of the business, then we can remove the inappropriate sharing both inside of the organization, but equally, if it's been shared with external recipients who shouldn't be able to receive that, we can automatically remediate that as well. But with these integrated DLP controls, they actually go a stage further than just around the security misconfigurations and the oversharing of data, because this essentially is built on top of our CASB solution. So we have got all of the watermarking, the redaction, the enterprise digital rights management functionality and so on built within here. So if a user does go to download some sensitive data, but maybe they're pulling that down onto a personal device rather than a corporate device, then maybe you can stop that entirely. Or maybe you'll say, well, actually, we support a bring your own device policy, but let's redact out some sensitive data, some PCI data, PII data, before that's downloaded onto a corporate device. And if that file is going to be shared with somebody outside of the organization, or you're worried about that personal device being compromised, then we can wrap the enterprise digital rights management around the file to ensure that it's not only encrypted, but you've got the access control policies there, so that if we do share that data with a third party who is trusted to receive it, but then they forward that on to an inappropriate recipient, that EDRM protection will travel with it so that the inappropriate recipient cannot access the file. So that set of protection controls is very comprehensive when it comes to enforcing the DLP policies. And because those DLP policies can be driven not only by the classification of the data, but also based on the contents of the file, based upon the users, where they're stored, where they're located, whether they're accessing it on a managed or unmanaged device, you can enforce a very granular data protection policy here that will protect what's important while facilitating the legitimate business processes, so you can keep that end user friction and that operational overhead down. So just wanted to start to end this by talking about a case study where we've used our DSPM solution to help an organization that we're dealing with. So in this case, it's an insurance provider that provides services into construction, manufacturing, healthcare, and so on. And they're quite an acquisitional company, so they've been growing very aggressively through acquisitions, and that kind of meant that they were facing a number of challenges. Part of the challenge was because they were acquisitional, it was helping them to get good rapid visibility into where there were data and compliance risks within the acquired organization, so that they could wrap the appropriate protection controls around that. But also, as an organization, they were going through their digital transformation journey. There was drivers to adopt AI within the organization. So they traditionally used Fortra DLP within the business, and up until that point, it had done a good job for them because they were predominantly on premise. They hadn't moved that much of their data into cloud environments. But as they were moving more and more data into these cloud environments, the SaaS apps and so on, then they were concerned about, once the data had left the organization, how did they get the visibility into the data risks in these cloud repositories and enforce the controls around that. So they chose to deploy our DSPM solution to sit alongside our DLP solution and complement the on-premise piece there. So with the data security posture management solution, they could extend their discovery and classification policies into their cloud environments. And as they added more and more in there, they could very rapidly integrate with the new cloud environments to extend their coverage and the protection there. As they onboarded new acquisitions, again, they could use those rapid integrations into the cloud repositories of those acquired companies to understand where they had the data risks, and then use those integrated classification controls to make sure that the data of the newly acquired organization was classified using the parent company's classification schema, and then the integrated DLP controls could protect the information within there. And then using the combination of both our endpoint DLP controls and our cloud DSPM controls, that allowed them to facilitate the adoption of AI within the organization with those appropriate guardrails in place to stop the users from doing something, maybe with the best will in the world, but that could have put sensitive data into those AI repositories and those AI apps as well within there. So they were able, with a very small security team, to cope with both the digital transformation journey, but also the increasing demands from the number of acquisitions that they were bringing into the organization to get good visibility and control around their data security and their compliance risks. The piece I wanted to end on is our data risk assessment. So if you want to understand maybe where you have hidden data risks within your cloud environments today, then we do run these free 30-day risk assessments. Think of them as a proof of value in terms of the functionality that we can make available to you. These are low risk from your point of view, so we can use the API connectors to connect into your environments. We'll essentially look, but we won't touch anything that's within there. So we can do the data discovery for you to help you understand maybe where there is sensitive information within inappropriate repositories within your environment. We can assess the data risk in terms of the oversharing of data, both internally and externally, or misconfigurations. We can give you visibility into who's uploading the data in there, or where it's been taken out of there, and who's taking it outside of that environment. And we can essentially sit there for think of it as if we run it for a 2 week exercise, then we'll scan the last 30 days worth of data to help you understand where there's data at rest that's posing a risk to you. We can look at the data in use for that 2 week period. So you really get a snapshot of 6 weeks worth of activity and visibility around that data risk. And if we find nothing, then that's brilliant, because that helps you to demonstrate that you've got an effective set of controls in place around that sensitive information. But I'll be honest with you, probably about 9 times out of 10, when we run one of these data risk assessments, we do find hidden data risks within customer environments. We do find that oversharing of data, that inappropriate downloading and usage of data within there. And that can often be very useful to help you understand where you have the risks within the organization, and then plan the next logical steps in terms of how you can mitigate the risks from within there. So if you do want to learn a little bit more about that, then please feel free to talk to your account executives from the Renaissance side of things. If you're on the channel side of things, then talk to your channel account managers, and we can facilitate that for your customers. So what we've covered in this session today really is we've looked at where our data security posture management sits within our wider data security portfolio from Fortra, and then that wider cybersecurity portfolio with the DSPM solution that can integrate with your cloud repositories today, help you understand where you've got the hidden data risks of data in inappropriate locations, or that's been inappropriately shared or accessed or exposed by some of the misconfigured security controls, and then you can use the integrated DLP controls within there to protect that information. And then we touched a little bit on some of the roadmap in terms of our integrations with the on-prem file stores to extend that into your on-premise environment, integration with the data lake houses, and then the API integrations into the kind of corporate co-pilots and chat GPTs of the world to extend some of the data discovery around there as well. So that's it from myself. I think we've touched on a number of the questions as we've run through this, but are there any others that have come in, Michael, that would be worth?
Listen, Nick, firstly, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It gives you a chance to catch your breath. It's a whistle-stop tour through DSPM and all things data. I think for every organization, the environment has changed so much as well. Because I mean, we're talking about AI tools, and I mean, we could have talked about them 6 months ago or 12 months ago, but they're everywhere now at this stage. And
Yeah.
they're widely used. Whether deployed is the word or not, but they're widely used. In a structured or unstructured way, I think is the question. In fact, there's a couple of points that I took out of what you were talking about there in terms of managing the operational costs and the overall cybersecurity burden. And I think for everybody on this session, indeed everybody in the industry, they're probably the two key challenges they have. They have operational costs. You can keep spending money, but you have to find somebody to give it to you, and you have this overall burden, which is just getting larger and larger, and it's a nightmare for a lot of people. But that's just my sort of comment. Another comment, I guess, from what you're talking about, I think a huge strength, obviously, in what you're talking about are the interconnectors and the integrations, the whole discovery and integrations and the interconnectors between the various platforms. But listen, no, there are a couple of specific questions. Maybe if I can throw some of them out here to you. Question here was in terms of data centers, where the data center is located. And I think this is something we see in lots of places. People, data sovereignty, everything else, all those little challenges that we all learn to live with every day. So where are the data centers connected, or sorry, located rather?
Yeah, so the data hubs, which are the most pertinent point here, are in four locations. The one that's, I guess, most relevant here is the Frankfurt data center. We've got them in Dubai, Singapore, and US. There is segregation there. So if you're in Frankfurt, then your data is in Frankfurt and it's not been shared with the
Yeah,
US or any of the other repositories there. And there are edge locations within Europe as well. Well, if you take the secure service edge for the web gateways and so on, but the relevant piece is Frankfurt for the data storage side of things.
yeah, I think that's probably the once Frankfurt is all good here anyway. Um,
Cool.
a question here, sorry, in terms of and I think this perhaps comes just back to your data risk assessment that you mentioned there. Can you perform data discovery on data older than 30 days?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the data discovery, we keep it relatively limited in scope, just so you can get rapid results around that. But we can easily extend that to historical data. It's typically charged around the 1 terabyte, per terabyte of data. For the scanning there. So as part of the discovery, we can understand what cloud repositories and apps you've got and how far back you want to go within there, and then scope that so that we can. There's no hidden costs. There's no unexpected costs. It'll all be explained up front in terms of what your requirements are, and then we can tailor that around that.
Yeah, and I think from what you were mentioning in terms of the integrations are pretty much most things that you can discover into at this stage.
Yeah, I think the nice thing about that DSPM platform is we, as an organization, because we've grown a lot through acquisitions, you saw from that initial cyber
Yeah.
attack chain, we've got over 20 solutions that sit within there. But actually, data security is one of the ones that's got a lot of investment, and especially around the integrations between the products. So DSPM. It's extending that coverage to help to close the gaps in both the on-premise environments, but more and more of the cloud repositories there. And then once you've got that visibility, those integrated controls can, again, because they're built into the solution, that means you don't have to go off and now I understand what my risk is. Now I've got to find a third-party thing to protect me and work out how to configure the policies. It's all integrated in the same place.
Make the problem easier to solve. And
Yeah.
just in terms of, and I know you mentioned the acquisitions, etc., that you have. So, and there's a number of data classification solutions within that. But what classification solutions do you integrate with?
Yeah, so in terms of the DSPM, we integrate with our own data classification suite, which people still talk about Titus and Bolden James, who we acquired about
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
6 years ago now. They've been pulled together as part of that data classification suite, so we can we can apply the same schema for the on-premise and the cloud side of things. And we integrate with Purview because it's so prevalent in a lot of the conversations we deal with. One of the things to point out with organizations who already have Purview in place is we can actually build on top of the Purview classifications. So if they have gone down that purview route where they've started off, well, it's part of E5, so we might as well use it, but they're starting to hit against those barriers of those 4 sensitivity levels. Um, we can take those sensitivity labels, but rather than just this being confidential, that's where we can essentially add those additional pieces of metadata labeling to say, well, it's confidential, it's business information, it relates to this client, it contains GDPR, this is the retention period, and so on. So you're not throwing something away, you can actually build on top of that to reduce the false positives from that point of view. And then Google labels as well.
Okay. So you're protecting the investment that you made in whatever platform that you're working with, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
essentially.
Yeah, yeah. No, excellent. And this is the last question I have. And if there are any other questions, if anybody wants to pass them into chat or Q&A. But the last this one here, which came in, it talks about what SaaS, IaaS, and PaaS platforms do you support?
Yeah, so today, we've got the wheel where we've got the GitHubs and the GitLabs because more and more we find the organizations who are building their own, building their own solutions. There's concerns about the source code. You, you need to give people access to it, but you need people to be able to download your entire source code repository. Probably not. So that gives you the visibility and control around there. There's the more standard OneDrives, SharePoints, Dropboxes, Google Drives, and so on of the world. We've got the integrations with some of the CRMs now. So Salesforce is quite a popular one. And with Salesforce, what we often find is it's not only the controls that are built within there, but it's being able to enforce policies around managed and unmanaged devices. So, as an organization, I've got my laptop in front of me. It's got the endpoint agent on it. If I go to our Salesforce instance, then, I should be able to do whatever is appropriate within there. If I log into that same Salesforce instance on the iPad that's beside me, that's my personal iPad, well, maybe we'll allow that, but maybe I can only add a new customer account in there. I can't, download, 100,000 customer records onto my personal device. Or we can use the integrated redaction to say, well, when I access one of the existing accounts from my personal device, then we'll redact out certain bits of PCI or PII within there. So
Okay.
that integration with those CRMs, I think, is of huge value. ServiceNow as well, and then the S3 buckets and the blob storage is a very valuable piece there. And then we touched on some of the extensions in terms of the Databricks and Snowflake that are coming as we run through this year, and then some of the on-prem file stores by the end of this quarter.
Excellent. Okay. So it's a comprehensive, truly, and it really is resolving the operational cost, cybersecurity burden challenges, I guess. Listen, Nick, excuse me, thank you very much. And thank everybody
Pleasure.
for attending. As Nick said, the data risk assessment is available to all. Please reach out to any of the Renaissance team, any of the Fortra team, and we'll organise to get that sorted out for yourselves. You will have a follow-up in relation to this, and you will be sent a link to the recording. But any questions, queries, please come back to any of us. We'll be delighted to assist, and we will follow up. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.